Welcome to Christian Theological Seminary's Lifelong Learning Webinar Series, titled Navigating a Disorienting Age. At CTS, we are dedicated to fostering an academic community that embodies God's liberative, restorative, and life-affirming message. This year, as we celebrate our 100th year anniversary, now 101, we are thrilled to continue this vision with all of you. Today's webinar is part of our series, Skills for Flourishing Congregations. This series emphasizes practical applications for faith communities, offering theological insights and tools to empower and strengthen our congregations. In today's session, we'll explore the vital role elders play in our congregations, offering wisdom, life experiences, and unique gifts. Providing compassionate care for elders involves challenging negative cultural perceptions and deepening our understanding of the aging process. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Francisco Losada. I am the Vice President and Dean at CTS, Christian Theological Seminary. Welcome. Now I would like to turn it over to my co-host, Professor Suzanne Coyle, who will introduce herself.
Thank you, Dean Lozada, and a big welcome to all of you who are joining us this day. I am here at CTS, a professor of pastoral theology and marriage and family therapy. I'm also the Lois and Dale Bright Professor of Christian Ministries. In my spare time, I direct the marriage and family therapy program here at CTS, which is nationally accredited by COAMT. And this past year, we just celebrated our 30th year of being nationally accredited.
Good. Thank you, Suzanne. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Karen Scheib. Karen is a writer, teacher, and lover of words, stories, and people. She is now Emerita Professor of Pastoral Care and Pastoral Theology at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. She is turning her attention these days to helping those in ministry flourish through attending to story and writing practices. Karen is the author of Pastoral Care, Telling the Stories of Our Lives, and Attend to Stories, How to Flourish in Ministry. She holds an MDiv from Pacific School of Religion, a PhD from Vanderbilt University, and a MFA in Creative Writing from Seattle Pacific University. She is ordained minister in the United Methodist Church. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Scheib. Karen, the stage is now yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to everyone. I would like to begin the presentation with a brief thought experiment. And I'd like to have you think about, just for a minute, what comes to mind when you hear the word old. So hopefully you have some paper and pencil by you, or you can use your computer. I'll give you about 20 seconds to think about what comes to mind when I use the term old in reference to a person. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to do the same thing for the word with the word elder. What comes to your mind when you think of the word elder in reference to a person? And then we'll go to the slides. So I can't see you to see if you had any different responses to those, but if you did, you can put them in the comments, and maybe we can take a look at those in a minute. I'll tell you why I'm beginning here. I'm beginning here because the words we use to talk about aging make a difference. This is actually an experiment that Professor Guy Miko conducts with his first-year medical students, and it'll be interesting to see if your responses mirror those of his students. But when they came up with such words related to old as negative, words were wrinkled, bent over, fragile, frail, feeble, stubborn. The responses to elder were mixed and more positive terms, such as wise, respect, leader, and experience. I begin with this because I think that the words we use to describe older adults and the stories we tell are important. This is actually reported in a book called Elderhood by Dr. Louise Aronson. I commend the organizers of this event for the title of this lecture is Wisdom Keepers, Holistic Care with Elders, because as I said, these words matter. In this presentation, I'm going to do three things, and this will relate to why I began with this experiment. I want to begin by exegeting the cultural narratives of aging, which significantly suggest ageist, we did the thought experiment, which we're going to do three tasks. Exegete the ageist cultural narratives of aging. And the reason for this, they may seem a strange place to start. It may not feel practical, but I will hope to convince you by the end that it does matter, and that the stories that we tell about aging significantly affect the lives of elders of our congregation. So one of the most significant things we can do is to understand the power of these stories and challenge them. Ageism negatively affects the lives of elders in our congregations, and I will use story care, which is an approach to pastoral care I've developed in my writing, to identify and resist these personal and communal narratives of aging. The second task will be to revise these communal and cultural narratives of aging. And because I believe the church has the resources to construct a theologically and psychologically informed counter-narrative aging that's complex, realistic, and honors the ongoing growth and life development of older adults. Such a narrative can provide a more nuanced and realistic view of the losses and gains of late life and help us to address the developmental needs of the elders in our congregation. And finally, we'll look at assisting elders in crafting their own personal narratives of elderhood that promote flourishing. I believe addressing all of these tasks will make the church a good place to grow old. Okay. So before we move into those tasks, I want to provide a brief introduction to story care. This is an approach I've developed over 2 books, Pastoral Care, Telling the Stories of Our Lives, and The Attend a Story. I also wrote a previous book called Challenging Invisibility, Pastoral Care with Older Women. And a narrative approach is utilized in that as well, and that the book is based on narratives that I conducted with older women. So story care, let me jump to the next slide. Oops, I'm not there yet. Okay. So I want to talk about the theological foundation for story care. It is a means of examining the narratives that shape our identity, beliefs, and behaviors. And the theological foundation is a relational anthropology, which affirms human beings are created in the image of the triune God and called to be persons in relationship. Put another way, God's story is a love story, and we are created to be in loving relationship with God, with one another, and ourselves. And God intends our well-being and our flourishing. Story care draws on the insights of narrative psychology and narrative gerontology, which both help us understand narrative identity development is an ongoing lifelong process. Narrative approaches to development understand our sense of ourselves, our lives, and a world are shaped and communicated through stories. These individual stories of our experience are shaped into a life narrative or life story. And it's not that our life is like a story. On some basic level, it is a story, a life story, a story that is telling itself in the living. Then this is a quote from Randall McKim, who are narrative gerontologists. So our life story may reach its fullest unfolding and attain its profoundest potential for meaning only in the later chapters, in our later years. So as our story develops, it grows over time, but in our later years, we often look back and reflect and revise that story, and we'll talk about that process. So the composition of this life story occurs over the lifespan. We're continually storing and restoring our lives. Storying occurs as we use story to organize and make sense out of all the experiences that happen through our lives. And neuroscientists actually believe our brains are wired for story. That's the mechanism we use to make sense out of our life experiences. Restoring is the process of expanding, deepening, reviewing, and revising, interpreting our stories as we gain new experience and insight. For example, things I believed as a child about certain experiences are different now that I can look back as an older adult with more experience, life experience. This process happens naturally over the life course. We gain new insights, we revise our stories, we come to a fuller understanding of ourselves. But we can also intentionally engage in this process when old stories no longer serve us, or they keep us stuck, or they confine us. So we need to exegete, reinterpret, revise, and restory. Okay. Our personal stories are not formed in isolation, but in the context of what are called narrative environments. This is a term from narrative gerontology. These environments include the settings of family, community, and culture, as well as all the stories, oral and written, that we encounter in these settings. And embedded in these smaller stories and narrative environments are what are called master narratives, which set norms and reflect dominant cultural expectations around categories such as gender, race, and age. So we're going to utilize a practice I developed, which I call life story exegesis. And I was very intentional in choosing the term exegesis. It simply means a close reading of a text. But if any of you have been to seminary, and I assume most of you have, you learn to exegete a biblical text, to read it closely, look at how it's formed, what is its audience, what is its purpose, what's at stake, who benefits from this interpretation. We can learn to exegete life stories, both personal and cultural ones, just as we exegete a text. And exegeting these stories that thwart personal and communal well-being leads us to new understanding and construct life stories that communicate an identity that's more positive and leads towards growth. So again, life story exegesis is a close reading of a story. And as I said, I chose the term especially because I wanted a term that was a theological rather than a psychological term. So we can use the gifts we have in exegesis from biblical text to help us understand the lives of our parishioners and the influences of the larger life story on their individual lives. The process of life story exegesis involves 3 steps: to analyze the impact of the narrative environments, and we'll talk about those, consider the backstory, and then to be able to move to revision and restoring. The process of life story exegesis begins by acknowledging and analyzing the impact of the larger environments and context in which our personal and communal stories are developed. It includes the influence of our backstory, or how do we get to this point so far, how we arrived at the current story, as well as our possible future stories. If you read novels, you'll know it always starts sort of in the middle of the action. You don't know the backstory of how the character got to that particular crisis. So the same thing when we're looking at our own stories, there's a backstory that forms how we got to this point. Once we begin to understand how our stories are formed, we can begin to challenge problematic stories that thwart our flourishing. This process of exegesis enables new interpretations of stories, promoting revision and restoring as we move towards hopeful future stories. So I want to begin our first task, which is to exegete the cultural narratives of aging in the US. The reason for this is, we'll get to in a minute, is that this is not just an intellectual exercise. Research now shows that negative attitudes about aging have physiological consequences for older adults, affect their well-being and their health. So We encounter ageism in multiple environments. We might encounter them in our families, how older adults are treated, or in education, or in the larger culture. A 2023 article in the Monitor in Psychology, which is a publication in the American Psychological Association, named ageism as one of the last socially acceptable prejudices. Ageism is defined, let me jump to slide 6. Ageism is defined as discrimination against older people because of narrative inaccurate stereotypes. And it's so ingrained in our culture that we don't even notice it. Ageism reflects our attitudes about aging, which shape how we think and feel and act about aging itself and towards older adults. Social attitudes about aging are largely negative in the US and depict later life as a period of unrelenting decline. This is not true in some other cultures. There are other cultures that tend to have a much higher respect for elders, and we'll talk later about the consequences of that. But a negative view of aging, or ageism, tends to see the aged as a burden and divides human beings into the young who are growing and the old who are declining. So I want to share a little of my backstory on encountering ageism. So just over 20 years ago, I wrote a book called Challenging Invisibility, Pastoral Care with Older Women. I conducted interviews with older women, about 20 of them, and ageism was not a topic I initially intended to address. I was 50 at the time the book was published, and I hadn't experienced the impact of ageism myself yet, but the women I interviewed had. Their responses and experience influenced both the title and the content of the book. The title of the book came from one of the women's interviews. One of the questions we asked were, how are older women perceived in our society? Most began by saying something like, I'm not old, but, then used all the negative terms. They're frail, they're not healthy, they're isolated, they're stuck in their ways, they won't, all those negative terms. They knew them, they had heard them, but they all started saying, I'm not old, but this is what old looks like. One woman, Anne, replied, old women are invisible. Didn't you know that? We are invisible. And she went on to talk about her experiences with that. And while she was the most articulate about this reality, the same thing emerged from many of the other interviews I conducted. The stories of these women told of invisibility occurred not only in the larger culture, but also in the church. And what these women were reporting were the consequences of ageism. I did not yet know what these women knew, and their stories pushed me to examine the cultural construction of aging and ageism. So when I was preparing for this lecture, I thought, well, it's been 20 years since I wrote the book. How are we doing with ageism now? So I read two recent books, which I'll mention, one by Becca Levy called Breaking the Age Code, and another by Tracy Gendron called Ageism Unmasked. They were both published in 2023. And unfortunately, some things have changed and others haven't. Ageism hasn't changed much. So a few things have changed since 2004 when I wrote the book till now. So one thing that has changed is the population of older adults. So the demographics of aging have changed. So the number of older adults in 2004 was approximately, what do I have there? 58 million. And that was in 2024. In 2004, 36.3 million were at the age of 65. I didn't put that up there. So in 20 years ago, there were 36 million. In 2022, there were 58 million. By 2050, there'll be 82 million adults over the age of 65. So this is a significant growth in the older population. And by 2050, as I said, this number, which will be 82 million, will represent a percentage growth from 17 to 23%. Before I get to aging in the church, I'll say the term that's been used to talk about this increase in older population is the silver tsunami. It's clever alliteration, but it's problematic because a tsunami is a disaster, a natural disaster of catastrophic proportions. So viewing the increase in older adults as catastrophic reflects the prevalence of this persistence of ageism in our culture, and that this is a problem that has to be solved or addressed, rather than seeing it as an increase in adults with wisdom or knowledge or life experience to share with others. So unfortunately, the demographics of aging are also reflected in our church, and the statistics are up here on the slide. The average age of members in mainline congregations is between 58 to 60 years old. In some denominations, it's slightly higher, 62 to 65 years of age. And one of the ways I think ageism presents in churches is that an older congregation is often automatically assumed to be a dying congregation. That may or may not be a case. Well, of course, any church that's losing members and not receiving new ones is clearly declining. But it may not be related to the age of our congregants. I attend a church that has probably 200 people in average age of 70, and we took in 20 new members last year. We live in a community that has a lot of retirees and is attractive to retirees. So we're pulling from our demographic. So we're an old church, but we're not a dying church. So that's something I often hear, is that sort of assumption. Okay. Ageism does not see aging as a natural part of human development over the life course, but rather as a problem to be solved or eliminated. The anti-aging industry, which encompasses anti-aging medicine and commercial products, is dedicated to this task of reversing the effects of aging or eliminating it altogether. As of 2020, the global market for anti-aging products is estimated at $52.5 billion. And that's expected to reach $83.2 billion in 2027. And this is just the commercial sector and doesn't include the medical sector. Now, in the medical side, in 1993, association was established called the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. And it led to an energetic renewal of efforts to confront aging as a treatable disease, rather than aging as a natural part of the life course. This organization uses militaristic terminology to describe the fight or battle to end aging. And gerontologist Tracy Gendron argues that the anti-aging movement has profoundly influenced the social structures that support ageist thought and practice. Not only has the impact of ageism on medicine, commerce, society, and on the individual lives of older adults not changed in 20 years, it's actually gotten worse. This is kind of depressing when I was doing this research. So one of the interesting books I read was the book called Breaking the Age Code by Becca Levy, who is a gerontologist and psychologist. And she's a social scientist, so she looks at the impact of attitudes about aging on the life course of older adults. So ageism, it turns out, is not simply a nuisance for older adults, but negatively impacts the health in their lives. Researchers in several fields have documented this. As early as 2002, Levy and her colleagues demonstrated how positive and negative attitudes about aging actually affect how we age. Elders often internalize these negative social attitudes, which affects their physical, mental, emotional, and social and spiritual well-being. In contrast, Levy's research showed that people with positive attitudes towards aging live on average 7.5 years longer than those with negative attitudes of aging. So let that sink in for a moment. Negative attitudes towards aging affect one's life expectancy. And I'll just throw in here quickly also that Levy found out through her research, and a lot of this was based on longitudinal studies that looked at people's health developed over time, that also had asked about their attitudes towards age early on, and so they could track that. Age beliefs also impact the expression of the gene that puts people at risk for dementia, and that people that had positive beliefs were 47% less likely to develop dementia than those with negative beliefs. So the US has a high rate of dementia, and it's also a culture with a low value on elders. India has an almost zero rate of dementia, and it's a culture that highly values and respects elders and finds ways for them to be involved in life and society. So this is basically summarizes some of what I'm talking about here. So in Levy's book, she argues that related physical changes are not solely a consequence of biology. Her research demonstrates that physiological changes linked to growing old, things even like hearing loss and cardiovascular disease, are also products of age beliefs absorbed from our surrounding culture. Levy cites research showing that non-biological factors, including age beliefs, determine as much as 75% of our longevity. So only 25% of our longevity is thought to be determined by our genes. So her research shows that these age beliefs impact whether and if these genes are expressed. They're powerful, but so is the environment. So in other words, when it comes to factors that determine the health and well-being of older adults, the social environment can trump genes. Now that's good news for us because this means we can challenge the negative impact of ageism by providing a more complex and positive view and create environments of communities that support this view. And I think the church can play an important role in this. Unfortunately, I think the church is not immune to ageism. One of the myths, as I said, that the older church is a dying church. Our ministries with elders are often well-intentioned, but may unknowingly reflect ageist attitudes. The women I interviewed 20 years ago reported such experiences. And there's an article that I'll cite in the bibliography called "Is Your Church Ageist?" published by Discipleship Ministries that lists many examples of ageism in the church. And these are a few of them that planning ministries for elders without their involvement, attending to the development needs and growth potential of children and youth and young adults while ignoring the developmental needs of older adults, assuming growth and innovation requires older adults to step aside. And this article lists a lot more examples than I have time to mention. Richard Gensler, who's written extensively about ministries with older adults, challenges the notion that young people are the future of the church. He in fact states that older adults play an increasingly vital role in the future of the church. And if you look at the demographics, that bears out, given that the average age is between 50 and 65. Older adults as a group give proportionally more financially in supporting the programs and ministries of the church. They often serve in leadership roles and support the outreach ministries of the church. And these realities argue for the importance in intentional and meaningful ministry with elders. So now we've moved quickly through our first task, is to look at the powerful impact of the narratives of ageism and exegete this, and look at the master narrative, which is communicated through multiple narrative environments, a family, church, and the culture. When aging is viewed as unrelenting decline, we fear it, and this fear supports our rejection of aging and then of elders. When dismantling powerful narrative, it is wise to ask who benefits from the maintenance of the narrative. And it's quite clear that one of the beneficiaries is the anti-aging industry. So understanding aging is an ongoing holistic process with interconnected spheres of human development helps us counter the dominant narrative late life as a singular process of decline. Elderhood does include change and potential losses, but it's also a time of becoming, developing, and growing. And I may have skipped a slide. Okay, we're on task 2 here. I think I missed a page. Just a second, I've got my pages backwards. So we're now moving to the second practice of revising our story of the cultural narrative. As we begin to understand how the story is formed, we can begin to look at some alternatives. So I'm going to now, okay, yeah. All right. So the Christian story provides us with very important and helpful resources to craft an alternative story. We can draw on our rich biblical and theological heritage in constructing a story of elderhood is a time of ongoing growth and development, while acknowledging that change and loss are indeed a part of our human condition. Pastor and theologian Will Willimon advocates a vision of aging as a time of active discipleship, fulfillment of our vocation, service, and Sabbath-like connection with God. At the same time, he insists we must embrace the story God is writing with our lives, learning to love the plot, even when it takes unexpected and undesired turns. As Christians, we're called to an ongoing life of spiritual growth. To use a technical theological term, which as a Wesleyan I'm very fond of, we call this sanctification. It's a process of continuing to grow in grace and in love. And this is part of our lifelong process, and it can be a particular focus of our growth in late life. So pastoral care has always been an interdisciplinary endeavor informed by theology and the social sciences. So drawing on the insights of gerontologists and psychologists like Levy and Gendron and others in their research, bringing this into conversation with our theological concepts can help us to craft a much more complex and positive story of elderhood. So research in gerontology provides a deeper understanding of elderhood as one stage in our lifelong development. We tend to divide people into young and old as if somehow they're two different species. But we can see this development as part of our lifelong process and that God is directing us in our growth. Recognizing that we experience dynamic change in 4 different domains, the biological, the psychological, the social, and the spiritual, helps us develop more holistic practices of care. So to see aging then as a holistic process with interconnected spheres counters the dominant narrative of later life as a singular process of decline. And again, as I said, while losses are part of life throughout life, now we may face a particular cluster of losses as we get older, but it's still a process of growing and becoming in late life. So as we move towards a more complex view of aging, we think about it as decline. It includes decline, but also growth and maintenance all at once. It's a process of adaptation and growth. And while some capacities diminish with age, like fluid intelligence, other capacities actually increase, like crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is being able to solve a problem that you've never encountered before quickly. But crystallized intelligence allows you to draw on accumulated knowledge to solve problems. So they're both helpful ways of understanding problems. And we increase in crystallized intelligence as we get older. And those who experience aging as a life journey are more likely to feel their latter years include renewal and engagement as well as loss. So when we turn to crafting personal So as we begin to challenge this now of how we can use these theological resources and gerontological resources to rethink how do we communicate what it means to grow old in the church? How can we help individuals do that? And because the views that individual elders hold makes it different, our third task then is to look at how we help craft the personal stories of elders as they reach later life in ways that promises flourishing. And I want to look at 2 developmental needs that often appear in the personal narratives of elderhood. One is rediscovering vocation, and the second is meaning making in terms of loss. And we'll go through these relatively quickly. So retirement is a significant experience for many older adults. It's a transition into elderhood for many. And retirement is an odd thing because if you go to a doctor and they ask your occupation, if you a teacher, a professor, a plumber, you put that down. If you're retired, you just put retired, which tells you nothing about the person. It tells you absolutely nothing except they're not what they used to do and that they're no longer working, but not what they're doing, what their values are, what's important to them. So I think recovering a sense of vocation can be very important in helping people make this transition. And I'm using vocation in its original meaning as God's call on our life. Now, for some, retirement may provide respite from an unfulfilling job and represents freedom to pursue leisure. But for others, retirement may lead to a loss of identity and purpose. I know many people who are weary of work, but fear the emptiness of not knowing what they will do with themselves and seeing a life of leisure as unfulfilling. So retirement tells a story of the past, but it doesn't help us construct a story of the present or the future. So recovering an understanding of vocation as a place to which God calls us, I think can help older adults find a sense of meaning and purpose and identity in late life. Redefining oneself in terms of what you used to do, a new narrative of vocation can be formed. Many authors, including Richard Rohr, describe late life as a time focused on being rather than doing. This can lead us to imagine a vocation in terms of being kind, being helpful, being empathic, being understanding. This does not rule out being active, because it may be that we also define our vocation in terms of activities, such as being a Stephen minister or volunteering at a hospital or a homeless shelter or another setting. I've always liked Frederick Buechner's definition of vocation, and I think it's particularly helpful here. There are different kinds of voices calling you, he says, to all different kinds of work. And the problem is to find out which is the voice of God rather than of society or superego or self-interest. The place God calls you to is a place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. This can be true of our vocation in elderhood. One of the women I interviewed for Challenging Invisibility said to me, "Why didn't someone from the church sit down with me when I retired and ask me about my vocation, about where God is calling me to be in this part of my life?" And I think that is a very good question. And I imagine some of the various ways the church might assist in vocational discernment. Certainly an individual pastoral conversation are an option, whether with a pastor or with the Stephen ministers. There are several programs to help people discover spiritual gifts, such as the Clinton Strength Finders. There is a program available through Stephen Ministries. You may have someone in your church trained in the Enneagram. Any of these tasks to help us identify our spiritual gifts and discover a sense of vocation. Who is God calling me to be in this part of my life? I'd add one quick word of caution. Churches can be tempted to quickly identify retirees as new recruits to plug in to fill the needs of the church that may or may not match the gifts of that person. So that's why I think helping people discover their vocation can help them find the best places to serve in the church. The next task I want to cover quickly, so we have some time for conversation, is meaning making in elderhood. Losses do occur in late life. And they occur due to functional losses such as illness and certainly the loss of relationship due to death. And some of our pastoral care with older adults will be accompanying them through these losses as they seek to make meaning out of what has occurred. Meaning refers to the core beliefs and frameworks through which we make sense of things, understand the world, and shape our sense of purpose, and assign significance to life and suffering. Meaning making is a process by which we interpret situations or events in light of our previous knowledge and experience and worldview. It is one of the primary tasks of elderhood, according to most gerontologists, and it is also a primary task when we face the loss of someone through death. Loss, whenever it occurs, disrupts our life stories we have lived so far. It disrupts our anticipated future stories, and it is one of the most generally significant losses we have experienced and affects our life in multiple ways. When someone dies, the plot takes an unexpected twist, or a major character in our story disappears, challenging the continuity of our stories. And this begins a process of a search for meaning on multiple levels. And contemporary grief theory identifies this reconstruction of meaning as the central process of grief. So this is a task with which the church can help older adults. And that certainly means accompanying them through this process, where again, through individual work or through grief groups. In chapter 8, I think I have this up here. These are some of the strategies for meaning making. This is out of my book, Pastoral Care, Telling Stories of Our Lives. These are specifically related to death. But offering something like a grief group in the church can be an excellent way to help older adults. We just started one at my church We advertised it at the beginning of January. We started at the end of January. We have 8 members in the group starting from scratch. And most of those are from the community. Only a few are from actually our congregation. In the bibliography, I mentioned the book I'm using right now is Understanding Your Grief by Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who's from the Center of Loss and Life Transition. I highly recommend this material to you. I think it's excellent. It can be a great guide and you can utilize it. It's got a leader's guide. We can talk more about that in the question and answer period. Finally, I just want to close by talking about what Richard Gensler calls faithful aging. The church has the resources to minister older adults as they experience the complexity of aging, so they not only age well, but faithfully. And again, shaping the cultural stories and shaping personal stories that foster resilience will affect the physical lives and health of our older adults. So to age faithfully, Gensler says, is to see and know that all of life and every stage is a gift from a loving God. To age faithfully is to trust in the promises of God, to stand against the cultural prejudice of growing old, to develop a new understanding of self-worth, and to age faithfully is to be a part of a congregation that knows that spiritual growth is possible and relevant for older adults. And one need I wanted to talk about but ran out of time was connectedness. A need of older adults is to be connected. And there's a lot of research on the impact of social relationships and connection and well-being. And the church is certainly a place that provides that for a lot of older adults, and we can do better at that. So just in closing, to say I do believe the church can be a good place to grow old, where we celebrate the gifts of elderhood, we accompany each other through inevitable losses of life, and celebrate growth and grace and love that God makes possible in all stages of life. The end. I know I rushed through that a bit, but I wanted to make sure we had time for some questions and conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we'll turn now to Q&A. I think there's I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to hold back a little bit and yield to my colleague, Suzanne, to go ahead and get the Q&A started.
Thank you, Karen, very much for raising this critical issue for us in the church. And I'm thinking back upon my growing up in rural Kentucky in a congregation where everybody was involved and elders were definitely honored. And so I'm interested in all your research. If you've found anything that gives us a picture of how perhaps these attitudes and narratives toward aging may have shifted over the decades in the church.
In a positive way or negative way? I mean,
well,
I think
both and.
And I think one of the things that's clear is that cultural attitudes have shifted, continue to be negative. I think one example, again, the silver tsunami is part of that. We fear all of these older adults is going to cost us a lot of money. It's going to be a burden on medicine. It doesn't look at what are the gifts older adults might bring to communities or congregations. The same thing with the anti-aging industry, which has grown, which tells us to fear aging, to overcome it, to beat death. And that's really a bottom line. If you don't age, you're not going to die. That raises serious theological questions. So I do think there's a cultural shift. Churches can be and often are countercultural. You know, I'm in a church like you grew up in, which is mostly older adults. It's run by older adults. It's funded by older adults. We're drawing new older adults. Those can be countercultural examples and I think healthy places. But how do we draw more people into those communities and help them find and support? And my guess is these churches have people that may have themselves more positive attitudes towards their own aging. And so they're pushing against and resisting those cultural narratives. So how do we foster and support that?
Yeah. Thank you.
Karen, I'm going to jump in here real quick with a quick question. And it sounds like much of the presentation, much of your thinking had focused on how, I don't know how to put this, those who do not maybe not see themselves as elders might begin to break down some of the stereotypes about aging and what contributions elders can bring to the congregation. If you were speaking to a congregation of elders, what wisdom will you share with them?
Well, I think elders sometimes do themselves hold ageist attitudes. I can't do this anymore because I'm old, which may or may not be realistic. And one of the pieces of research, I think, in Gendron was that younger people that had negative attitudes of aging were more likely to have certain kinds of illnesses than younger people with positive views of aging. So it even is predictive. So the other day earlier in the month, I was doing a seminar with a colleague from Bright online, and I was having trouble with getting my PowerPoint slides up. I've done it multiple times. And I said, oh, I'm in the wrong generation for this. Somebody called me on that. That's an ageist attitude, that I can't learn new things. Well, I teach on Zoom all the time. I was just having a bad day. I couldn't quite figure out the right thing. I was not as sharp that day, but it doesn't mean I'm unable to learn new things or new technologies.
Yeah.
So, we incorporate these attitudes. One is the assumption, oh, I'm going to get Alzheimer's. Well, 10% of the US population have Alzheimer's. It's a relatively high rate, but again, the research shows us that our attitudes, if we expect that, it's not that it's magical, but that we limit our own possibilities. We're telling ourselves a confining story. That doesn't mean we have this view that everything's possible. We need a balance of, we have losses and gains in late life. How can we help people to do that? And so I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, you did. You did. That's very helpful.
Examine their own assumptions about aging.
Yeah, no, this is very helpful, because in the last month, I've been in a couple congregations, spoken at one where it's an elderly congregation, and when I share some of my thinking, the response was, I'm old. This is from the elderly. I'm old. I'm not changing my thinking. And you got me to thinking, well, perhaps they bought into the ageism sort of stereotypes, that they cannot be open-minded any longer. They're closed. And
and I would question, were they closed-minded when they were younger?
Yeah.
Because we tend to be sort of persistent, in our attitudes, and
Okay, thank you. Let me go to some questions here from our students. Let me show you here. This is from Allison, MFT student. Would backstory include family of origin?
Yes, it does. And in my book, Attend a Story, How to Flourish in Ministry, I talk a little bit more about the backstory, that it would include our family of origin, the stories we've developed growing up. One of the memoirs I used to teach out of was called Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal? And the opening line was, my mother used to tell me the devil sent her to the wrong crib. There's a whole backstory there. So that obviously came out of her family of origin, and her whole memoir is about rejecting that backstory.
Okay, great. I think this is more of a comment, but I'll show it to you. I think this is a reference to something you said earlier. My new cardiologist asked, what did you used to be?
Oh, gee.
Yeah. I used to be a human being. I still am one. How about you?
Yeah,
that happens. Yeah, that's a great example,
Okay. And this is from our colleague, Helene, Dr. Russell, sort of commenting on popular culture and whatnot. So the new series, Matlock, with Kathy Bates, highlights the problems of ageism and how she uses it to her advantage.
I think that's good. And I guess one of the positive, part of the age wave is being led by baby boomers, and some of them are still in roles of power, like in Hollywood and other places. So I think we are seeing a few more examples of older adults in media than we used to, and that are more positive examples. So that's a good thing.
And let's see, I'm going to show you this, but I know the answer already. Again, from Allison, will the bibliography be available after the presentation?
Yes, I think my last slide had, which I maybe didn't put up, was that it's available by request, and there's my email. You can email me if you want the bibliography and the slides. I can send both to you if you ask me to do that. So.
Yeah, and Allison, I have the bibliography as well. So, okay. And let's see here. I think it's more of a comment if I'm reading it correctly. This is from one of our student, another MFT student, Moai and Okinawa practice may have implications for this work. Reimagining aging, living collaboratively, sharing rites of passage and process death. And if I may add to it a little bit, have you found anything? What can we learn from other cultures that might contribute to the?
Well, and he mentions the Blue Zone work, and one of the books that I mentioned also refers to the work of the Blue Zones. This author who looked at cultures where people age well and are healthy well into centenarian life, and it has to do with community is a big role of it. Elders are valued and are active in the community. Their wisdom is, people seek out their wisdom, and diet is a part of that. So there are cookbooks about that, but a lot of it are related to community and culture and the value of older adults. In our culture, your phone is old in a year or two, and you get a new phone. And so things that get old are not valued, but in other cultures, the collective wisdom is seen as valuable, even though it's not technological information. So
okay,
it's a helpful comment.
Suzanne, we have room for another question from you, but as you process your thinking here, let me throw out another question, Karen. And this is within the political world that we live in today. How much have you deconstructed what happened up to the lead up of President Joe Biden stepping down as a result of the comments towards ageism? Have you given much thought to that, or how does that play into?
I mean, that's a mixed bag, because one of the things we often do is we immediately assume that dementia is a part of growing older. Dementia is a disease process. 10% of adults over the age of 65 have dementia. So that means 90% don't. So in Biden's case, he had a disease that was affecting how he aged. But I do think that our attitudes towards the elderly, and particularly towards people with dementia, are problematic, and I think maybe have affected that process. I want to pick up a comment from Janelle Johnson, if that's okay. She talks about older adults having leadership in the church, but pairing with younger persons to support administration or technology tasks. I didn't have a chance to talk about intergenerational cooperation, but I think that's really vital. And a lot of churches are often one of the few intergenerational places left where younger and older adults connect, because often kids are apart from their grandparents. So I think anything that we can do to promote intergenerational cooperation is great. So I just want to highlight that.
Suzanne?
Well, I want to just comment on that too, because I am interested in this intergenerational focus. At one point in my career, I was a chaplain at Central YMCA in Philadelphia. I'll make this quick. We had a lot of elderly folks who lived there. It was a residential place. I made contact with a hospital down the road from Center City. They had children who they only did shunt procedures for children who had brain disabilities. And I made a connection between our older folks at the Y and these kids who their parents couldn't stay the whole time. And it was a wonderful experience. I noticed a distinct difference in the members in my little congregation who were older after they went down there, and they felt like they did something valuable and generative.
Well, and that's back to the question of vocation. And someone asked how to engage the wisdom of elders. I think one is to help them discover what their gifts are, to name those. Again, retirement says, I used to do this. Well, what skills did you learn early in your life that are still helpful? Maybe you're good at organizing things. Maybe, you had a job where you use any variety of gifts. We don't get rid of those gifts. We often choose occupations because it builds on our natural talents and skills. How are those evident now in your life? So I think in terms of to help older adults, just to assume they have wisdom and ask them, what do you think you can contribute? And it might be hard. You might have to work to help them identify that, because often they've been told they're outdated and their wisdom or their knowledge is not useful. So is there a way to see gifts, abilities, skills, again, being values? I'm a good listener. So often we think in terms of jobs that need to be filled in the church, and that may not be the most helpful way to think about it. Rather in terms of what gifts do they have they bring to the life of the church. Because we need communion servers, or we need ushers, or those are jobs to be filled. And maybe the best people for those jobs are ones who are outgoing and are good communicators and like to talk to people. But trying to match their gifts, their innate traits, the wisdom they've accumulated to the job, rather than just the other way around. So,
how do you navigate then with older adults in a congregation around patriarchy, for example, and has that filtered into any of your thinking or your work?
I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
patriarchy in terms of men being in charge, kind of thing.
Yes, as we need help with the child care area, and so there's a tendency to look at the older woman in that rather than the older men. Does that? Or serving communion or collection or something along those lines.
Well, I do think some of that happens. I mean, one of the women I interviewed was a teacher, and she said she'd been in leadership roles in her church, but when she retired, she was only asked to help with educational activities. And she was the one that said, why didn't somebody ask me what my vocation is, what God is calling to me, what other gifts do I have to use besides just working with children? I think there's some of that. I don't always see it in leadership. Our council director, or the head of our church council, is a woman in her 60s. She also happens to be a judge. So, she's a powerful woman in her own right in a field that's in the past been more men than women. That may be changing. So, I think that depends on individual churches. The reality is often there are more women than men in the church. Again, my congregation is unusual. We have a women's Bible study that has mostly older women, 25 generally on every week, and a men's group that has about 20 every week, older men who gather for Bible study. That's a little unusual. I think you have to look at each congregation, and those attitudes are still there to some extent, but as the baby boomers grow into aging, I think those will shift a little bit.
I see. And let me just finish up. I'll finish up with a question, and then a comment by one of the guests. For some people, how do you prepare? Is this maybe a silly question, but how does one begin to prepare to move towards this world of living in the elderly world when you're close to retirement or something along those lines? I don't know if I'm making sense there, but it's and I think some of that your topic on narrative writing, your journaling, that sort of thing, as one participant says, these are antique treasures in many ways. Yeah, well, one of the things I found when I wrote the book on older women, I had just done a postgraduate certificate in gerontology, and I actually wrote the book because I had students in seminary. I was at St. Paul School of Theology, serving mostly older congregations whose view of the older adults they didn't really know their people. So I asked them to interview an older adult in their congregation, and they all came back and said this older adult was unusual because they were vibrant, they were active, they were healthy. So that's what led me to think that we had this problem with sort of ageist attitudes.
let me go back to your question. How do we prepare people? Oh, so what I discovered, age is not a category we use to describe ourselves. Other people use age to describe us, but because I wanted to explore how older women experienced aging. But when I tested that question, I got laughed at by potential interview subjects. I don't think of myself as old. I asked a woman who was in her 80s, how are older women perceived? I'm not old. So I think that if we let go of age as a category that we use to describe people, and we just look at their gifts and abilities and help them think about, life is ongoing development. You're now in this part of your life and you realize you have less time. How do you want to spend it? I do think the whole issue of how we face death that's a whole nother huge topic.
Sure.
And how our culture is pretty death averse generally, in many ways. So.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our webinar today, but let me just finish it with one comment by Robin has loved this, and I think that's the sentiment that I've been reading on many comments of with today's presentation. So with that said, thank you so much, and
My pleasure.
Give a round of applause in your own different ways. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing with us your knowledge and your wisdom. Thank you.
Well,